Describing this as unprecedented, talking about the response, talking about the casualties, the deaths, many children, and says the focus now is those in hospital, those left homeless, and they will need to investigate the cause of this. And it's a wake-up call, he said, to address the situation of housing in inner cities in South Africa.
Live from Nairobi, this is Focus on Africa on BBC News. Our top stories. More than 70 people have died, including several children, as a fire engulfed a block of flats overnight in a suburb of Johannesburg's central business district.
Actual fire escape was closed, so there was a lot of people, a lot of people smoke, people suffocated, a lot of people died because of the smoke.
The African Union convenes an extraordinary meeting to address the crisis in Gabon as a new leader is appointed. Also in the program, the threat multiplier. We'll tell you about the link between climate change and crises in African countries. Well, many thanks for joining us. You are watching Focus on Africa. I'm Waihiga Mwaura. We start in South Africa, where at least 74 people, including 2 children, have died in a fire at a 5-story block of flats in Johannesburg. Dozens of people were also injured, and there are fears that the death toll will rise as search and recovery operations continue. The emergency service had said the building in the city's former business district had been abandoned and was used by migrants and homeless people. Officials said many bodies were found pressed against a closed security gate. It's been described as one of the worst fire incidents in the city's recent history. The head of emergency services in Johannesburg says the cause of the blaze is currently unclear. Now, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is at the moment addressing the press in Johannesburg. Let's listen in to that.
We are going to ensure that we root out all criminal elements and restore the livelihoods of people who live in the city.
All right, so there he is speaking to the situation there and stating that, and taking questions from members of the press, stating that any criminal elements that were involved in this, will be brought to book, and 12 children is the number of fatalities. Let's listen in.
Government needs to embark upon from the city level, provincial level, and national level, and in terms of according our people the rights that they should have. We often find that there are restrictions, impediments that stand in the way. For instance, when it comes to accommodation like this, when a building is condemned and when we can find alternative accommodation, we go through too many processes, too many regulatory impediments that then can lead to this type of situation. And so Parliament needs to look at this so as to enable us to be able to execute and put in place the rights that our people should have without going through too many difficulties and impediments. That is something that we are also looking at. There are many rules that hold us back from doing what is right by our people.
Mr. President, Tim Beckner from Newsroom Africa, when you talk about impediments, are you referring to the NGOs who've gone to court and said it's unconstitutional to evict people from these illegal buildings without providing them with alternative accommodation? And if you say this is a wake-up call, why has it taken the deaths of close to 18?
Right there, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa in a live Q&A there with members of the press, speaking to criminal elements that he has mentioned will be handled in this particular matter, and also speaking to the impediments that have stood in the way of being able to ensure that such buildings and such incidents actually don't happen. But let's get more on this, and we stay in Johannesburg, and we want to speak to our correspondent Pumza Filani, if we can get her on the line. Thanks there, Pumza. I'm sure you've also been trying to listen into what the president had to say. But first of all, tell us the latest about the rescue operation.
Well, officials are still out in the Johannesburg inner city conducting what they've described to us as a recovery operation. Recovery because they've said they don't believe that anyone that's found at this stage will sadly be found alive. They've said that those who were able to get to safety will be housed in various buildings across the city of Johannesburg for the next few nights until another plan can be made. We heard from the president there, who got to the scene a short while ago, saying that this was a tragedy of unspeakable proportions, and that it is a death that they do not wish on anyone. We are starting to get a picture of who some of those people that were affected by this tragedy are. We know that some of them were African migrants from neighboring countries who came to South Africa in search for better job opportunities. We also know that some of the residents of that building were South Africans from poorer provinces who too came to the City of Gold to try and see if they can improve their economic prospects. And how they came to live in that building, we understand, is that this is part of a wider problem where criminal gangs take over unsafe buildings or derelict buildings that have been abandoned, and they rent those out to anyone that's desperate enough to live there, often bypassing any sort of safety regulations or rules, and just piling in people into those buildings, as many as 10 sometimes in a small room, all to make a quick buck.
Piercing screams ring out in the dead of night as a fire rages through a building in the heart of Johannesburg. Home to hundreds, residents have described the horror of people clamoring to get to the nearest exit as smoke filled the building's narrow corridors. Many were not that lucky.
The actual fire escape was closed, so there was a lot of people, a lot of people smoke. People suffocated. A lot of people died because of the smoke, because there was a lot of pressure at the gates. Some of the gates were closed.
As bodies are pulled out of the gutted building onto the street, grief sets in for some of the survivors. The reality of their loss sinking in. Many of those who've died are said to be burned beyond recognition. Hours later, and the flames are finally out. This has now become a recovery operation, emergency workers have said. Officials have told the BBC that it is unlikely that any more survivors will be found. They still don't know the cause of the fire.
Since it's a hijacked building or an abandoned building, there might be two options here. It might be illegal connection, or it might be other heating devices which they are using. Because we are told that at the time when the fire started, they didn't have electricity.
Residents in the building were living in squalid and crowded conditions, described by authorities as an informal settlement with shack-like partitions. The building was condemned, declared unsafe by its owners, the City of Johannesburg, but had been taken over by property gangs who rent out old buildings to scores of people in a room. This one was home to working-class migrants from neighboring countries, as well as South Africans from poorer provinces who came to Johannesburg in search for better economic prospects.
Buildings like this, stay away from them, remove yourself from them. No one is heeding to the call. And also, on the part of government itself, the justice system is also failing us. When we identify the hijackers, we want them to be prosecuted. Somewhere along the line, they are let loose in the justice system. It's out of our hands as a city. They come back and do this.
The investigation into the fire is at its early stages, but this story is only going to get worse for those affected, left without a home or any belongings. left waiting for news on friends and family as the number of fatalities increases.
And in terms of the latest information that we have, at least 74 people have died, including 12 children. But Phumza, of course, the big question that everyone is asking is, could this have been prevented?
That is a question that many people are asking in the country this evening. Some of them pointing to the fact that more should have been done to evict, or rather move, the people that were living in this building and move them out of there and move them to safety. But another thing that's being said is that this is just one small example of how widespread this problem is. The city centre was once a hive of business activity, and many of those businesses moved to more affluent parts of the city, leaving that area pretty much to go to ruin and become derelict. And this is how then those gangs that are said to have taken over these buildings were then able to thrive and thrive for so long. So very difficult questions will be asked of the authorities around what they will practically do to take these buildings back away from the gangs, make them safe for people to live in, and also what will happen to people that are found to be behind these hijackings and whether any of them can and will be brought to justice.
Indeed, those are the big questions, Phumza. Thank you so much for speaking with us. And I actually want to take that your point and now pose it to Angela Rivers, who's the director of the Johannesburg Property Owners and Managers Association and joins us now on Focus on Africa. Angela, thanks for your time. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to my conversation with Phumza, but the discussion of will anything change after this? What can be done in terms of the problem of hijacked and dilapidated buildings in Johannesburg? Any ideas of solutions?
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it. I hope that the city does do something, that this is drastic enough for them to take it seriously, because the Johannesburg Property Owners and Managers Association has been harassing, begging, pleading, trying everything to get the city to take this seriously for the last 20 years. This is not a new issue. The city was well aware of the problem properties within the inner city, and there have been for at least since I've been in this position, which is 9 years, and they have done nothing in 9 years. So hopefully this will be the catalyst that gets them to start really looking at this problem seriously.
Angela, what do you think is the biggest issue? Is it the political will? Is it the economic cost of resettling those who are in those buildings? What do you think stands in the way of a long-lasting solution?
So there's a couple of hurdles, the main one being that we have an act in this country called the PI Act, which is the Prevention of Illegal Eviction, which prevents people from evicting illegal residents on their property. And there's a clause in the act that says you cannot evict anybody unless they have alternative accommodation, which needs to be supplied by the municipality. The municipality is not capable of supplying any accommodation. They have no idea what they're doing. Buildings where they do have residential buildings, their collection rates are 12%. They're collecting 12% rental on the buildings that they do have, and they've lost control of their residential buildings. There's a very famous hijacked building in South Africa, in Johannesburg, called Casimir. It is a council-owned residential building, and within 6 months of them opening up the building to residents, it was hijacked, and it has been hijacked for the last 5 years. The city has done nothing. Every now and again, they come, they do a tour, they do an inspection, and then we never hear or see them again. So the first portion is definitely the PI Act is very restrictive. However, the building does have a problem properties bylaw, which empowers them to do building inspections on these buildings and declare the buildings unsafe to live in. That is a policy that they have written themselves. It's been in existence for the last years, and yet they don't use it. I personally feel that one of the biggest problems that we have with our municipality and our governments, provincial, local, presidential, is that they are arrogantly incompetent. They don't know what they're doing, and they will carry on pretending that they know what they're doing until something like this happens. The only way to get rid of building... Sorry, I'm jumping
because I was going to ask you, I was going to ask you, and we'll wait for the authorities to finish the investigation, but the families or the family members of those who are in the building, who've been standing outside the building the whole day, hoping for news of their loved ones, are asking themselves, who do they hold responsible tonight? From a legal perspective, what does the law say about incidents like this? Who would be charged in court, for example?
The city of Johannesburg they should be held for murder. They own the building. They knew it was hijacked. They know it's a problem property. We've been begging for years for them to fix it. They've done nothing. They've sat back and they've let the hijackers have free reign in the inner city. I personally think that the mayor, the city manager, the MMCs of housing, everybody, they should be convicted of murder. They are responsible for these people that have died in this building. They are solely responsible. They allowed this to happen.
Well, Angela Rivers, we'll have to wait for the investigation to happen. But thank you for sharing your thoughts there. That's the director of the Johannesburg Property Owners and Managers Association joining us on Focus on Africa. And of course, we'll follow up even when the investigation begins as the search and recovery operation winds down and give you more details as and when we get them. But still to come, the threat multiplier. How are countries dealing with conflicts, tackling climate change?
Free speech is meaningless unless you allow people you don't like to say things you don't like.
After winning, the people were so proud and it was so intense.
Сказав моїй дружині, треба збиратись, треба піднімати дітей. Почалась війна.
I never thought I was going to be a famous movie person.
When big names talk, they talk to the BBC.
I want Hip Life to be that good story that lifted black folks in Africa and all over the world. Gave young people a voice.
It's part of being an actor because I always say as an actor you can't be a control freak. You have to be willing to give up control.
So I like this idea of a live piece of art. And I just like this idea of making invisible visible.
Sometimes you can have really serious portraits, but you've got such a great laugh. I feel like I want to capture some of the candid nature of your personality.
Opera House can and must be many things. It shouldn't cater just to one audience, and it shouldn't be focused on just one corner of the repertoire. It must do everything and be open to the interests of many different people.
Inspiring arts and culture on BBC News.
Welcome back. You're watching Focus on Africa. Now, in the last half hour, the African Union has suspended Gabon. Now, it's after President Ali Bongo was ousted last night in a military coup and General Brice Oligui Nguema appointed as the head of the transition. Gabon's main opposition party asked the military to complete the ballot counting process in order to recognize the victory of its candidate. In the meantime, the military are maintaining a curfew until further notice, but have restored internet access and international media broadcasts, which had been cut off by the government on Saturday. Now, who is General Nguema? Well, the 48-year-old military officer was a member of former President Omar Bongo's circle, serving as his aide-de-camp. Under President Ali Bongo, he served as the head of intelligence for the elite Republican Guard, the most powerful unit in the Gabonese army. His appointment was made in a statement on national television. Let's listen.
Following a meeting today attended by all the commanders-in-chief and chiefs of staff, as well as the generals in the 2nd Division of the Gabonese Republic, General Oligui Nguema Brice was unanimously appointed President of the Committee for the Transition and Restoration of Institutions and President of the Transition.
Well, let's now get more on that with international security and development policy expert and an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, Dr. Fola Aina, who's joining us from London. Dr. Fola, thanks for your time. Let me first get your thoughts on that breaking news, the suspension of Gabon by the African Union. Did that catch you by surprise?
No, thank you very much. It actually didn't catch me by surprise because very often the African Union is known to have more rhetorics and less action. And as the case has been with similar cases like this, whenever there's been coups on the continent, the African Union has mostly responded by condemning the coups and also going a step further to try to suspend, the military, the country, headed by the military junta. But I think a more proactive measure rather than a reactionary one such as this would be to ensure that mechanisms are put in place that helps to prevent, coups from taking place in the first instance.
Okay, so which then so if you're saying it's more rhetoric and less sort of action from what you're looking at, then do we expect a response from Gabon, or at least the team that's in charge at the moment on this? What are you hoping to or expecting to see within the next few hours with that news now out?
Yeah, so again, what I suspect the military junta in Gabon is going to do is simply ignore the African Union as other juntas have done. And as you can rightly see, they so far appear to be playing the exact cards that the junta in Niger have played, which was only, which only just came into place about a month ago. So far since they've come into, since they've taken over power, they've essentially put President Ali Bongo on house arrest and also declared treason on his son. In addition to trying to win the hearts and minds of the population, which interestingly in the capital Libreville have shown them some form of support, and showed some form of congratulatory response, to the actions of the military. So basically, I think we're trying to win the hearts and minds of the Gabonese people and less concerned with what the international community thinks.
Okay, Dr. Aina, if you're able to tell me this very briefly, what is this mechanism that you're hoping the African Union would put in place to prevent, the possibility of coups in other countries? If you're able to briefly speak to that.
So one of the things that the African Union can do first and foremost is to try to strengthen regional mechanisms alongside regional economic communities that helps to ensure, for instance, that the rule of law and also the separation of powers are properly adhered to. And with regards to the military, ensuring the professionalism, and proper training of the military in such a way and manner that prevents them from taking on an active role in the political process. In addition to ensuring that some of the underlying root causes of the reasons why the military is stepping in the first place, such as endemic socio-economic issues, are properly addressed. That way, there's little or no reason or justification or excuse given by the military to step in.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll have to cut the discussion there. That's Dr. Fola Aina joining us from London. Now, people living in African countries dealing with conflict, political instability, natural disasters and other humanitarian crises are most affected by the effects of climate change, and yet they've contributed the least to global warming. A new report by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, shows that these factors, when combined, is making the situation in affected countries very complex. We want to talk more about this, and joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Laura Ramarillo, who's IMF's advisor to the Middle East and North Africa. She's also one of the authors of this particular report. Laura, thanks for joining us. So how many people are affected in African countries that you found in your report that are vulnerable to the effects of climate change?
Yes, thank you. So what we found in this new report is that in fragile countries, climate vulnerabilities and these fragilities interact and exacerbate the impact that it has on people and the economies. And what we're finding is that these climate shocks increase conflict, they increase hunger, and they impact displacement. One of the key findings is that climate change will lead to an increase in deaths associated with conflict up to 10% and even 14% in the most affected countries. We also find that climate change will lead to an increase of about 50 million more people going hungry because of climate change. And we also show that...
I beg your pardon for interrupting you. This report could not have come out at a more opportune time, with African governments meeting at the Africa Climate Summit next week in Nairobi, Kenya. As you reflect on the findings, what can what's the call to action to the world with that summit coming up?
Yes, there are some actions that countries need to work on to improve their ability to deal with these climate shocks. They need to build their capacity to react to extreme weather events and to respond, also build resilience over time. But the point I want to emphasize, and that we're emphasizing with this report, is that fragile countries do not have sufficient means to deal with this on their own. And that is why it's so important for the international community to step in urgently to provide support. Our estimates show that fragile countries need about 1.5% of GDP per year to build this capacity to deal with climate shocks. This compares to 1% for other countries that have greater resources. So it's really important for to provide this support.
Well, thank you so much, Laura, for joining us on the broadcast. Laura there, who's the IMF's advisor to the Middle East and North Africa, joining us on the program and just sharing a little bit on that new report, even as all focus is on the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, Kenya next week. Now, feel free to get in touch with me and some of the team on social media. I'm at Waihiga Mwaura at BBC Africa as well, and we have more coverage on the BBC Africa website. But that's all the time we had. Many thanks for joining us. I will see you again tomorrow. But from me and the rest of the Focus on Africa team that made this whole broadcast possible, thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you tomorrow. Goodbye.